Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 177 of the Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Join us as we once again delve into the intricate landscape of criminal behavior, not to sensationalize, but to understand, to educate, and to shed light on the hidden corners of the criminal mind. Our society is dotted with names that send shivers down our spines. Names synonymous with acts that defy human comprehension. One such name, Ed Gein, has often been thrust into the media spotlight, with films and sensational stories amplifying his deeds. But today, we are taking a different approach. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Jerrod Brown. Dr. Brown's expertise is not only rooted in his role as a faculty member at Concordia University, but he's also the founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. With a deep commitment to research, he has written extensively on topics related to criminology, authored several books, and is renowned for his presentations at national and international conferences. It is safe to say that Dr. Brown's is a voice that carries weight and insight. Together with Dr. Brown, today we will be embarking on a nuanced journey into the mind of Ed Gein. Our goal? To pull apart the complex tapestry of factors that drove his actions, and more importantly, to equip today's probation officers and human service professionals with the knowledge they need to identify early warning signs in their caseloads. The cases we discuss here are real, the stakes are high, but our mission is clear: to foster a deeper understanding of the criminal psyche, and in doing so, perhaps prevent future tragedies. So, without further ado, let's delve deep and explore the science and stories behind the headlines. Now, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the show, Jerrod. Always nice when you grace our presence, and I'm really excited today because we are going to be doing another chapter in our ongoing series of profiling infamous serial killers. This week, we're going to tell the tale of Ed Gein.
Glad to be back, Joe, and I'm very excited to talk about this case because this is one of the most high impactful case in American history. This case has inspired multiple movies, books, songs, and there's a lot of misconception. I thought I knew a lot about his case until I started digging way deeper, knowing that I'll be talking to all of you today. And I was pretty surprised. There's quite a few things that I did not know about. So we'll talk about all that today.
Yeah, I'm really curious to unpack that because, as you said, as we'll reveal to the audience members that don't know it, Ed Gein's case has been used as an inspiration for filmmakers and television programs and all sort of creative types. And I would also contend, and maybe this is what you discovered when you were researching for this episode, Jerrod, is that there may be some sort of armchair criminologists that think they know about the Ed Gein case because they know the character from Silence of the Lambs who was inspired by Ed Gein, or they're aware of the fact that the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that the villain, the character of Leatherface, was loosely based on Ed Gein's character. But you're right. Sometimes we blur those lines between fact and fiction. And it's good to get to the get to the source, as we say. So I'm really glad to unpack it. And again, I'm really excited to have you on the show because, as we've always stated with these profiles, our aim, our goal is not to sensationalize or anything along those lines. It really is to examine this case through your awesome forensic lens, but to also help current practitioners, human service professionals, recognize perhaps some of these traits, some of these precursors, some of these same pathways into criminality that they might recognize in their caseload so that they can be better equipped to assess and intervene. So it's really all about process improvement and not sensationalism.
Spot on. And we'll look at this through a forensic lens, but also, more importantly, in my opinion, the neurocriminological lens. And maybe just plant a few seeds on things that we don't know with this case, but some questions to ask in any kind of case. And you mentioned 2 of the 3 most well-known movies that's inspired, but also Psycho.
I forget all about Psycho. That's right. The Anthony Hopkins character in Psycho, based on the Ed Gein character, per Alfred Hitchcock, at least. Yes.
Well, I've been thinking hard about this, and I'll just put some things out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there about all these serial killers we profile. You start looking at different sites, crime sites. It's very difficult to know what's true and what's not. The same with this case. This case is way different than all the other ones we've profiled to date. But people will probably be surprised to hear that. Is he actually a serial killer? That's the first thing to think about. I bet you're surprised to hear that, Joe. I see your facial expression. Is he really a serial killer?
Nice reading my poker face. But I was mentioning to my father-in-law earlier today that I had this appointment with you to record the Ed Gein episode. And of course, he recalled from his childhood, his younger days. And to your point, I said something about, all the people he killed, but then I caught myself and said, well, I know he exhumed a lot of bodies as well. So that would not technically fall into that definition of a serial killer. I'm not sure if that's where you're going to go, Jerrod, but
yeah, it is.
Do tell.
Yeah, I mean, you look at all the sites, you look at lots of articles and books, chapters written on him. They always call him an infamous serial killer. The word is serial killer. But by all accounts, he killed 2 people. There may be more, but he admitted to 2. So it's difficult to know. And there's a lot of information at the time these crimes came out where there's just a huge media frenzy that came to the town where he lived. And I think a lot of information was probably thrown out, and it just grew and grew and grew with time. So I'm not going to sensationalize what he did. We'll talk briefly about that, but let's just talk about Ed Gein. He was born in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and died in 1984 in Madison, Wisconsin. He died while incarcerated at that time. Look, if we won't get into the legalities of this case, we just don't have time, but you can find all kinds of things in terms of his insanity defense when he went to the forensic state hospital. After so many years, they deemed him competent. He went back to court, got sentenced, and went back to confinement. By all accounts, he was a model prisoner, but there's some things we'll talk about with that as well. So again, like you said, he's inspired lots and lots of movies, very famous movies that we're all probably very aware of. He was given several names in the media at that time, but the most common ones was the Mad Butcher and the Butcher of Plainfield. There's other ones that pop up, but those are kind of the big ones. Depending on what article you read, what documentary you look at, what newspaper report you look at, and even journal articles, there's several dissertations where students will mention him and talk about this case. Some people call him a twisted killer, the real life boogeyman he's been referred to. Everything that has been talked about with him, he was an odd person. This is just socially odd. So take that into account. So we're going to talk about social skill deficits with him, and why any case you work on in the criminal justice forensic arena, we absolutely need to take into account social skill functioning. When these crimes happen, it shocked the community and the word spread quickly. Media just bombarded that community and the word spread worldwide. It really was a shock to the world in terms of the things he did. And again, we're not going to really glorify what he did by any stretch, but he did very horrific things to his victims, but also he was a grave robber. So we'll talk about that a little bit today as well. By all accounts, if you look at all of the articles and research that's been done on him, almost all of them indicate that his mom was probably the driving factor as to why he turned out to do these things. We'll talk about his mom. We'll talk about his school. He had a history of being bullied. By all accounts, too, he was emotionally immature. So if you're ever working with any kind of clients, how mature are they? Do they understand emotions? Can they process emotions? Can they name emotions? Don't just look at their chronological age, but take into account their emotional, social, and developmental age. That's very important with any case plan, any intervention plan you do. Very, very important. He had an obsessional interest with his mother. His father was an alcoholic. His mother, by all accounts, did not like his father, so he witnessed a lot of not so good things, obviously, growing up. Personality traits that were talked about him: he was very shy, quiet, and socially awkward. They did a lot of interviews with people who knew him in the community after these offenses, and I've looked at some of these interviews. You can find a lot of these interviews on like YouTube and documentaries. Most of the folks said, obviously, they were shocked. He was a little odd and stuff, but they never would have saw this coming. So take that into account as well. When we look at his family history, he grew up in a two-parent household for a period of time, but his father was an alcoholic. His mother was very domineering. They lived in one location for a period of time. The mom was extremely religious to the point where she didn't really let him socialize with anybody else. So he was very socially isolated. He had a brother. We don't know this with certainty, but some people speculate that he might have murdered his brother. They don't know. He died in very suspicious circumstances near their family farm. Look into that if you're interested in going deeper into that. His father was somewhat abusive. His mom was very verbally abusive. There is some indication, obviously we never know with certainty, but his alcoholic father, by all accounts from all the reports, beat him at times. And there is some speculation that he might have sustained a head injury from this. We'll never know with 100% certainty, but if you dig deep in the weeds, in the Ed Gein literature, it does talk about suspicion of head trauma. And a lot of these other individuals we've profiled, they have had documented histories of head trauma. If you apply that to the work you're currently doing in the criminal justice forensic mental health arena, the research is pretty clear that maybe half your clients have had head trauma histories. But I do want to stress that so many people have head traumas and they never become violent offenders. The overwhelming majority of people that sustain head trauma never go on to commit a serial offense. But if you look at people who've committed really heinous crimes, frontal lobe impairment needs to be taken into account, amygdala dysfunction, executive dysfunction. We'll talk about that, but those are things we've absolutely talked about in this series several times over. Before I go a little deeper in the weeds, Joe, about his mother, to see if you have any thoughts from your lens.
Well, I have a list of sort of the usual suspects, Jerrod, whether it's you and I talking about our ongoing series here on infamous serial killers. And just as you were speaking, I was crossing off some of the things I was going to ask you about. For example, TBI, traumatic brain injury, and you just noted that it can't be proven 100%, but he may have suffered a head injury at the hands of his father's abuse. So checked one of those boxes off. The next thing I had written down here was childhood trauma, which it sounds like you're about to cover even more when you talk about the relationship that Ed had with his mother. But nonetheless, I'm checking that box off as well. I've also got written down here those traditional criminogenic factors that we look at, which I can also dive in and give my 2 cents once you continue with the profile as well. But then I also like how when we've talked in the past, Jerrod, you'll even go beyond moving the microscope back, if you will, into, for example, what happened in that individual's childhood, but you'll even sometimes look at prenatal factors. So I'm curious what you have to say about Ed Gein when we get to that topic.
Yeah, definitely. Anytime we profile a case, you got to start at conception, in my opinion. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So if we look at this through the lens of the adverse childhood experiences literature, he grew up in a home exposed to an alcoholic father. That technically would be a type of childhood trauma. Maybe it's not directly, but then there's accounts that his father would beat him. So we have a couple things going on there. He got bullied in school. The original ACEs research didn't take into account bullying, but since that first study in 1998, they have looked at childhood bullying, childhood teasing, humiliation, rejection as being a type of an adverse childhood experience. Would it be constituted as a childhood traumatic experience that his mom isolated him from other friends? I would argue absolutely that could be a type of social trauma that's not as clear cut. But if a child grows up and they're not allowed to be around other kids and play and be in school, that's absolutely going to have a detrimental impact on social skill development, brain development, perspective taking, empathy, all of these things. So there is some accounts in the Ed Gein literature that his mother did not want to have a boy. She wanted to have a girl. How did that play into this as well? He did have that obsessional interest in his mom even after she died. By all accounts, this is probably a driving factor in this particular case. It's not the only factor. When we think of serial killers, and depending how you classify a serial killer, if you look at the serial killer literature, there's a high percentage of these individuals that probably have attachment problems. He clearly had attachment problems. He had to with all of these things happening. He did not have a solid childhood foundation where he could probably go to a loving, kind, warm mother and a stable father figure. So I feel pretty comfortable saying he probably had some very dysregulated attachment patterns. When someone has solid attachment patterns, just think of that as the foundation for building a house. When you have a solid foundation, you can build the walls and the roof on there and things are pretty solid and secure. If you were to build a house on a very fractured slab, over time, that whole house is going to be crumbling down. If you apply that to working with criminal offending populations, I think it's equally important to understand attachment theory as well as trauma-informed care and trauma-informed interventions. Because if you're working with folks that have had extensive trauma histories, trauma starts putting cracks in the attachment. And when you think of attachment, what happened in utero? Unfortunately, this case, Joe, I cannot find anything about in utero, what was going on during pregnancy with mom. And again, this case happened multiple decades ago, so I don't think these things were really considered a lot. But anytime you are working on any case, if you can get that data, what happened in utero? Was there exposure to drugs, alcohol, tobacco? Was mom in a domestic violence situation? Maternal malnutrition? maternal obesity, maternal exposure to environmental toxins. The list goes on. Whatever happens to mom and the stress, worry, anxiety, fear that she's under, or the lack of care she's doing to herself, all of that can be obviously impacting that developing child in utero. So really take into account prenatal factors as well. And if you look at the neurocriminological literature, it does talk about targeting prenatal interventions to help combat future criminal behavior. So when we think of attachment, when attachment is very solid and secure, typically that child is going to feel more protected, more nourished, more cared for within that family system. By all accounts, Ed Gein probably did not feel protected and heard and known and valued. So really focusing on attachment-based approaches can be very, very helpful. Joe, before I get into a little bit more on that head trauma piece, any thoughts on that from your R&R lens?
Well, yes, via the R&R lens, but I also wanted to share with the audience and with you indeed, Professor Brown, some tie-ins with the TIDES model that my colleague Nicole Stale and I have been introducing to the audience. And in brief, we've talked about how we have identified 4 components or four pillars of our model, which are reflective of what we think are deficits to be addressed and augmented, whether it's a client dealing with trauma and or a just as evolved individual who we're trying to get on that pathway of desistance. Those 4 major components that we came up with were those of self-regulation or self-regulation deficits, social support, resiliency, and identity. And just as you were speaking, you were really validating everything that we've put into, including self-regulation deficits in there. And you've been mentioning all the neurocriminology tie-ins. But yeah, just looking at impulse control through the lens of executive functioning, that the role of the frontal cortex. And then when you were talking about attachment theory, again, Jerrod, it was almost validation of, yeah, this is why we included social support. We know social support is so important regardless of the population. People with good social support just do better, whether you're treating addiction or paranoia or trauma or criminality. And you just did a good job of articulating that when you really kept peeling back the layers of what goes into attachment theory and the benefits thereof. And I would contend, Jerrod, and I could ask you this, did that lack of attachment, did the mother's approach to isolating Ed have a profound effect on his identity, which we know from the desistance literature? Identity really drives behavior. And of course, identity is tied to trauma as well, because people view themselves through their victimization, through their hurt self, if you will. So love to get your thoughts on all of that. I think we're on to something with TIDES, and this is just another illustration of, yep, all those, we're checking your math here, Joe. It all adds up.
Identity with him. Think about this. Mom isolated him from the world. Anytime he had a friend come over, she found something really wrong with that person, didn't allow that person back. He did not learn how to talk to the opposite sex. His only role model, maybe his mom for a long period of time. Don't know a lot about his dad. That's usually talked about with mom. Don't know a lot about his brother. It seemed, based on everything I've read, his brother seemed to be the healthiest one out of the bunch. But growing up, if we talk about this through the attachment and identity lens, he didn't learn how to differentiate between like a mom role and being a friend role. He never learned friendship skills. So that's the problem. You look at the friendship literature, huge component of people growing up and learning their identities. It plays a role in moral reasoning and development and empathy. So he became enmeshed clearly with his mother. He did not know how to differentiate. He didn't learn how to diffuse and become his own person. So that clearly played a role in some of his future problematic behaviors and his grave robbing. And again, I'm not going to get into that. I'm sure all of you know that if you want to look into that, just some of the things that he did to the bodies and the body parts, I think partially that may have been driven by some identity issues, some role confusion, attachment issues. And by no means am I saying that's the only factor. And again, if you work with clients with identity problems, with attachment issues, almost none of them are ever going to grow up and do these kind of offenses. But they may grow up and have more challenges with substance misuse, displaced anger, how to communicate their thoughts effectively, not knowing how to handle rejection, not knowing how to talk to coworkers. So this is how it could kind of play out if you're a probation officer and this client continually loses a job because they don't know how to talk to their boss when they get frustrated. They just fly off the handle and scream and yell, and they act socially inappropriate. They've never learned how to talk to the opposite sex. They don't know how to ask people for help. They don't know how to be assertive. They only know how to be aggressive. So that's how it could play out in your caseload if you're listening this as a probation officer, corrections, and things of that nature. But I think definitely identity plays into this. What was his self-esteem like? Did he carry a lot of shame? These would be unanswered questions I have. I don't know the answer to that. When we think about this too, adding fuel to the fire again, if he did have a true head injury, what kind of head injury was it? Was it multiple repeated blows to the head? If any of you work with clients in domestic violence situations, kids that grow up in abusive homes, there's some evidence that it's not just one head trauma we're talking about, but it could be multiple mild concussions over a longer period of time. So that can almost have a snowball effect. And if you look at the general literature on brain injuries have been linked with having more social skill impairment, more executive functioning issues, problems with understanding perspectives of others, more sensation-seeking behaviors, more empathy deficits, more risk-taking issues, and the list goes on and on and on. So understanding head trauma, regardless of the population you work with, is highly recommended because you're probably working with folks with head trauma all the time. When we think about threats to social connection, so he did not get a lot of social connection. A couple things I would recommend if we put that cap on: histories of being rejected, really digging into that. Histories of being isolated. Isolation is a major threat to our overall health and wellness. Just look at what COVID-19's done to a lot of people. I know people firsthand who seem like they've absolutely changed personalities after COVID. They're a different person. They were isolated for years. They're more suspicious now. They're more anxious. They've put on weight. They seem to have a technology addiction. They have a sugar addiction. These are things I've just witnessed firsthand. I'm not tying this back to serial killers, but let's just pick apart Ed Gein's history with social isolation. It's very, very important to understand that, because if someone grew up and was socially isolated, they probably don't understand the rules of social relationships. There's more social confusion. They probably have limited social support. So when things get rough, who do they turn to for help? A lot of these serial killers, if they've had these histories, they can't turn outward because everyone else around them is not safe. So where do they go? Inward. And if they go inward, fantasy development, that can grow over time. What kind of fantasies did he have? Did this grow? By all accounts, he was extremely mentally ill as well. A lot of these other serial killers we profiled have had some mental health diagnoses, absolutely. Some have been on the psychopathy spectrum. But by all accounts, Ed Gein was definitely dealing with a severe level of mental health issues. And I want to make it very clear that I'm not saying if someone has a mental illness, they become a violent offender. By no stretch of the imagination, I'm saying that. Most people with mental health issues are law-abiding citizens. But if you look at the research of folks in prison, a higher percentage of people in prison do have mental health challenges. Why? Head trauma, drug use, rejection, adverse childhood experiences, all of these things we need to take into account. And all of these things can impact development. And in the Ed Gein literature, it does specifically talk about these factors probably contributed to very poor social development. And if you look at the general developmental literature, what are the big things that we want to be aware of that could cause developmental problems? Attachment issues, school problems, problems with peer relationships, developmental delays, self-regulation problems are all talked about in that literature. And if you're interested in understanding like developmental psychology, what are the developmental building blocks of healthy behavior if you were to really do early interventions? Focusing on establishing a very solid household base with caregivers, family, and friends, being modeled appropriate behavior, learning how to interact in interpersonal situations, focusing on learning and growing. So kids that go to school and are interacting with other kids, very good. Focusing on language development. These are all critical aspects of developing healthy, appropriate boundaries, behaviors, and even brain-based cognitions, things of that nature. Ed Gein, by all accounts, seemed to lack a lot of those things that we're talking about today. Joe, any thoughts on that?
I'd bite my tongue here. Listeners may or may not know that you and I both reside in the great state of Minnesota, and it was tempting not to be a little bit snarky towards our neighbors to the east, Jerrod. When you were talking about social isolation, I thought to myself, well, come on, Jerrod, they live in Wisconsin. There's a lot of social isolation going on over there. But I did not say that, see? Just lost the Wisconsin audience. I'm kidding.
No, I know.
I did have a couple of more questions, and one, you've been sort of answering and addressing this throughout the interview, Jerrod, but we always talk about the fact that we highlight these cases for the current practitioner. Could you think of sort of the traditional red flags that a practitioner might think of, again, seeing these behaviors on a much smaller scale, or these red flags on a much smaller scale, and then maybe, as you've been doing, an intervention correlated with that, such as you've been talking up a lot of social skills today, which are fantastic from the cognitive behavioral bucket, but things along those lines.
Well, with his case, what do we know so far? We know trauma from mom and dad, possible head trauma, social isolation.
Yep.
We also know that I haven't talked about yet, that he ended up dropping out of school early in the 8th grade. So are there some learning challenges there? He was socially awkward. He was bullied quite a bit and laughed at randomly and just made fun of. And that there's some indication too that maybe he had some possible defects when early on in childhood. So we need to take into account, were there any kind of physical defects, abnormalities? In the neurocriminological literature, if you look at that literature, it does talk about birth trauma and birth defects might be a factor to consider for later on problematic behavior. But again, it's not as simple as, hey, someone was born prematurely, has all these problems. There's a lot of other factors at play here. Go ahead, Joe.
You mentioned earlier, Jerrod, we broached the topic of looking at this through the risk-need responsivity lens. And just now when you mentioned that he dropped out of high school, it reminded me, I sort of was going through the tally of criminogenic variables. There's one right there, deficits around education. But then I also reminded myself that when Bont and Andrews came up with these criminogenic variables, it's not so much for example, the presence of employment or having a high school diploma that buffers someone from risk. All of those criminogenic variables are anchored in social learning theory. So, for example, it's not just the fact that somebody gets up and goes to school every day. It's all of the pro-social students that they're surrounded with, which are modeling pro-social behaviors. Or it's just not the fact that somebody collects a paycheck every 2 weeks. It's the fact that they get up, go to work, and they're surrounded by positive pro-social models who model pro-social behavior, e.g., their their boss, their coworkers. So I guess it's just really driving home to the point that we talked about isolation. He didn't have pro-social models in his life from which we know the R&R framework is really anchored in.
Yes, social belonging. Look at that literature. Huge. Volunteering. Huge. Really mentoring, getting people hooked up with mentors. These are all wonderful interventions.
Yeah, and just even that sense of belonging or that sense of community that one gets from again, being a student or being an employer. I often make the comment, well, that's why a lot of young individuals join street gangs. It's because they lack that safety, if you will. You talked earlier about a stable home life, Jerrod, and all the benefits thereof. And when that's lacking in the home, people join a gang, or again, they don't have those pro-social role models and all the protection that it affords.
Absolutely. I know we're coming up against the clock soon, but a couple more things to think about through a neurocriminological lens. There's actually one article in the Ed Gein literature where the author brought up the point, could he had amygdala dysfunction? And in the neurocriminological literature, it does talk a lot about the amygdala. And if you're not familiar with the amygdala, it plays a huge role in like making sense of emotions. It's a part of the limbic system. It plays a role in emotional processing, emotional regulation, and fear conditioning. And amygdala functioning also plays a role in social judgment and moral reasoning, oxytocin production, which is a neurohormone, which has a lot to do with attachment. And when there's dysfunction in that axis, sometimes people can be more emotionally dysregulated. It can impact moral reasoning. It plays a role in attachment behaviors. There's all kinds of things that can negatively impact the amygdala. High amounts of stress, lots of trauma, head injuries, the list goes on. We talk a lot about the prefrontal cortex executive function, CEO of the brain, but in the neurocriminological literature, it talks a lot about understanding the amygdala as well. So that would be a really important topic for all helping professions to at least know the basics of, because that does play a role in mood and emotions. The Ed Gein case, again, very interesting, complex, a lot different than some of these other cases. We did not get into the grave robbing per se. I wish we had another couple hours because I got through about 20% of what I want to talk about. But let me leave your audience with a few things just to kind of chew on and think about, and questions that really popped up in my mind when we think about this case, and maybe consider some of these questions and thoughts within the context of whatever case you're working on. What was the prenatal history like? I do not know with this case. So what was going on with mom during pregnancy? Something to think about. We also want to be aware, what level of shame did Ed Gein deal with, if any? Did he start having so much shame he just believed he was a very defective individual and he started going inward? Don't know. After his mom and dad and brother died, and a lot of other things happened in between there, but he did a lot of odds and end jobs around town, so he wasn't necessarily socially isolated as he got older. He was more socially isolated as a kid. As he got older, he was starting to do odds and end jobs around the town, and most people said, "Oh, he's a likable guy. He's odd and stuff," but nothing bubbled to the surface where people thought obviously he was engaging in this behavior. Another topic to think about with the enmeshment with his mom: did he learn what healthy sexual development and healthy boundaries are? By all accounts, not at all. His mom was extremely shaming when it came to any kind of sexual behavior or associating with someone of the opposite sex. So that is definitely something we also need to take into account. What level was his fantasy development? Was it rooted in psychosis, or did he start developing fantasies early on in life where they just grew and grew and grew and he had deviant fantasies? I don't know. I just don't know. What about the right and wrong decisions and the moral reasoning and the topic of free will here? That's something we need to consider. We talked about that in the Charles Whitman case. What about behavioral genetics? Did that play a role? In the neurocriminology literature, it does talk about behavioral genetics as something we need to take into account. Was there other kinds of traumas we don't know about? So these are just a lot of unanswered questions with this particular case. And there's so much more. Joe, we could easily do a part 2 on this, but a lot of other things to think about. But Joe, do you have any other thoughts, questions, anything I could kind of dig deeper into that you heard that might be helpful for your audience?
I think you just answered my major question, Jerrod, which was, will you come back and do Ed Gein part 2? Because I really think we should give this subject matter its due diligence. And this has been so fascinating thus far.
Yeah, if we tease a part 2, he had a clinical history. He had some different paraphilias. He had some different diagnoses. We would want to talk somewhat about the necrophilia discussion. A lot of people, when they've heard of this case, they always think cannibalism. By all accounts, he probably was not a cannibal. People are surprised to hear that. Maybe he was, but there's early on when law enforcement came to that town, I think that got out and started spreading. What role did his diagnoses play in here? What role did his family play with this? We want to take a much deeper dive into that, talk a little bit about why he may be engaged in some of these horrific acts too. And if you watch Silence of the Lambs, you'll understand maybe why I'm not going into great detail, but I think from a psychological, neurocriminological lens, it might be helpful to dig a little bit deeper into that, why he did do what he did with human skin. Was it just based in deviancy, or was there some attachment and he was trying to maybe carry on his mom's legacy? A lot of things like that. So those are some things that we would definitely want to dig deeper into in a part 2 if your audience finds that helpful.
I'm sure they will. Jerrod, as I always do, I will load up the episode description of this podcast with links to your fantastic resources, up to and including information on your brilliant courses at Concordia University, of which I can announce I just graduated with another graduate.
Congratulations.
Thanks, Jerrod. It was a great program. Yes, your program, I took your graduate certificate program in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies, which was awesome. And it covers a lot of the things we talked about today, up to and including, of course, a lot of the neurocriminology stuff, which is now another program of yours that I've gone the rabbit hole on, becoming a neurocriminology informed professional. So I'll be sure to share details on those programs and, of course, my personal growth that's resulted because of taking those steps.
Truly appreciate it, Joe. Thank you for allowing me back on. Great insights, and I love to continue to hear your insights about this case through your R&R lens. And this is just, again, a very fascinating, extremely unusual case in my mind. When we profiled the Night Stalker, much more clear-cut in my mind, just in my opinion. This case, it takes a lot more putting together the puzzle. There's a lot of gaps here, and there's a lot of unanswered questions with this case, in my opinion. Even though he's inspired so many things, there's way more unanswered questions with this case than the other ones that we profiled from my standpoint.
I see Ed Gein part 2 on the horizon, my friend.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone.
Dr. Jerrod Brown, Concordia University. We will talk to you in the near future, my friend. Until then, be well.
Thank you, sir.
As we wrap up today's deep dive with Dr. Jerrod Brown, it's hard not to come away both enlightened and introspective. The journey through the mind of Ed Gein brought to light some invaluable insights that are paramount for today's human service professionals. One of the core messages that we extracted is the sheer importance of a holistic assessment and approach to our clients. From the very beginnings in prenatal stages, these early detriments can set the trajectory of an individual's life, for better or for worse. This case study's emphasis on the detrimental effects of social isolation was illuminating. It showcases the fundamental need for healthy play, especially in addressing and mending social skills deficits. A society deprived of connection, after all, is a society ripe for unraveling. The analogy Dr. Brown shared was particularly poignant. The idea of solid attachment patterns being akin to the foundation of a house. It's a foundation that provides stability, security, and resilience. But trauma, as we've discussed, can put cracks in this foundation. It disrupts these attachment patterns, leading to instability and vulnerability. And this is where the value of trauma-informed care, especially the TIDES model, becomes indispensable. It gives us the tools and the framework to recognize these disruptions and work towards healing them. I'd like to sincerely thank Dr. Jerrod Brown for joining us today. Your insights, as always, are both enlightening and indispensable for our community of listeners. We are eagerly looking forward to your next appearance on our show. To our listeners, remember, as we navigate the complexities of the human mind and behavior, let's continue striving for a world where every individual gets the understanding, support, and care they truly deserve. Until next time, keep seeking, keep learning, and always stay curious. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, program design, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
When someone has solid attachment patterns, just think of that as the foundation for building a house. When you have a solid foundation, you can build the walls and the roof on there, and things are pretty solid and secure. If you were to build a house on a very fractured slab, over time, that whole house is going to be crumbling down. If you apply that to working with criminal offending populations, I think it's equally important to understand attachment theory as well as trauma-informed care and trauma-informed interventions. Because if you're working with folks that have had extensive trauma histories, trauma starts putting cracks in the attachment.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.